tonight here with Dr. Jerome Corsi. If you've been following his articles on InfoWars about what's happening with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, you realize that the Obama administration has been seizing all of the assets from private investors and others to fund ObamaCare. This is something they couldn't get through, just as we saw with the Paris Climate Agreement. When Obama couldn't get that through the Senate, the constitutional process is to have that ratified. He just said, well, I'm going to self-ratify it. Well, he did something similar with funding of the Obamacare subsidies. Basically, he had a crisis of how he was going to pay for it. So he just decided that he was going to take the money from private investors. So we're going to talk to you about several things here. We're going to lay this out in a little bit different way than Dr. Corsi has done in the past. You want to be able to talk about this at length. So we're first going to tell you what this is going to mean for you as an individual, for private investors who maybe are holding some of this money, or people who have it as part of the pension fund that they may not even know that they're invested into Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. We're also going to talk to you about what this means for homeowners. Then we're going to break out what this means for the rule of law, and then we're going to look at the chronology of this, because this all began with the mortgage crisis. They took over Fannie and Freddie as part of the mortgage crisis. Then Obama took over Fannie and Freddie because he had an Obamacare crisis that he wanted to fund. But it really is now the solution to Trump's Obamacare crisis. How does he stop Obamacare? Well, the solution is the same way that he did with the Paris Climate Agreement, to shut down the extra legal, the unconstitutional, illegal actions of Obama and just pull out of this thing. We'll tell you how that's going to work. So joining us now is Dr. Jerome Corsi. Thank you, Dr. Corsi.
David, great pleasure to be with you again. Thank you.
Laid out for us what this really means for people, private investors, people who may have invested in this in their IRAs. I know my father had invested in Fannie and Freddie as a private investor. A lot of people maybe are into this because of their pension funds. So what does this mean for private investors when they have no security in the rule of law?
Well, I mean, first of all, the whole idea of Fannie and Freddie is that they're fundamental to our mortgage development and finance in the United States. Fannie and Freddie buy a lot of the mortgages that are made and package them into secondary issues for investors in Wall Street. And without Fannie and Freddie, we might not have the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, which is the key mortgage that most people use to buy their first home. And that's fundamental to being able to be a homeowner, is to be able to buy your first home and have it be financed. Now, Fannie and Freddie are both a kind of a hybrid organization. They have a government guarantee on the default of the mortgages that are bought by Fannie and Freddie, but also there are private shareholders who buy stock. And as you point out, many people through their IRAs or their pension funds may own Fannie and Freddie stock and not really be aware that that's in their portfolio.
Because they always viewed it as a very safe investment because it was guaranteed by the government. It was one of these things that was put in there like FDIC insurance to say, well, up to a certain point, the government's going to guarantee your deposits. It was set up there to create a confidence for the mortgage. So a lot of people who are not speculators, they're individuals, they're not big investors. They just want this because it's going to preserve their capital.
And there's two things that happened. And first of all, when the federal government came in 2008 and took over Fannie and Freddie in a bailout, the federal government did this and snatched control. They treasuring out warrants that they could own up to 79.9% of the Fannie and Freddie. And so that really diluted the ownership of the private shareholders to, very little compared to what it had been before.
Well, before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about this, because earlier in the broadcast, I talked about the moves by the Federal Reserve. The fact that they're raising interest rates, the fact they say they're going to shrink their balance sheet. In other words, there's a lot of things that were put in there to prop up the economy in the wake of the mortgage crisis by the Federal Reserve. They're now $4.5 trillion in with their balance sheets, but they're also raising rates constantly. So they're doing all these things in spite of the fact we don't have inflation. They're pulling out the props that have been under the economy. They're concerned that Trump's big trump card here really has been the economy. They want to put things in place that are going to pull that out. And of course, when they do things like that, raising interest rates, that's going to affect everybody's ability to sell their houses, the value of their houses, and so forth. That's a key thing. But before we get in the chronology of this and go back to the mortgage crisis, let's talk about what this means for the rule of law. Because first we had Obamacare coming in and they said, you have no constitutional authority to force us to buy insurance from an outside source. I said, all right, that's fine. We'll call it a tax. because you're going to be paying a tax to a private company. That's still a load of nonsense. And then on top of that, they found that Congress was not going to fund it. And so then Obama said, no, we'll just take it from these people. So that's the flow of where this is going. Let's go back now to the mortgage crisis and tell people about what happened with the conservatorship. You had just started to get into that.
In 2008, what had happened was largely the Democrats, through the beginning with the Community Redevelopment Act of 1977, had been forcing banks to write subprime loans, which are underperforming loans. And this got out of control, so that they were doing mortgage-backed securities that were packed with subprime loans. The whole thing collapsed.
Right.
Okay.
And we had people that were government officials, essentially making a lot of money off of Fannie and Freddie at the top by repackaging these. They were getting a big payout in terms of bonuses. So you had the people at the top really did get involved in some crooked dealings, just like we had the people at the top who were collateralizing these loans. But it was the investors who were buying it that were being deceived. And so they were the ones who were kind of left holding the bag and really are getting that bag stolen from them right now at this point. So what was the agreement?
A couple of things. First of all, Franklin Raines and Jamie Gorelick of The Wall, these are Democrats, made millions at the peak of the subprime crisis. Now, when the conservatorship came in and took the stock, basically diluted by Treasury taking 79.9% of the companies, shareholders felt aggrieved, and they didn't feel it was necessary for the bailout. They thought Fannie and Freddie could have survived without a bailout.
And let's repeat that. They came in when they took over conservatorship, and they diluted the shares of the private investors. After these guys at the top had made millions of dollars in commissions, then the thing starts to fail along with all these other banks. They came and said, we're going to take conservatorship, and they diluted their stocks. That was the first hit that the investors took.
And secondly, then they as Fannie and Freddie started to recover and really make money, and the federal government was Obama was facing the problem that the House had refused to fund the money in Obamacare that was needed to pay the insurance subsidies. These are the insurance for low-income people. And Obama had no way to pay that legally or constitutionally.
And let's back up there, because you point out in your article that a lot of people didn't realize, except for just a few Washington insiders, that Fannie and Freddie had returned to profitability.
Yes.
And they've now made $240 billion, you said in your article, since 2012. So they not only came back out of this, but they started to become very profitable. So now this is a pile of money that Obama can get to fund Obamacare.
And Obama took the money on what they call the net worth sweep. They decided they were going to take all the earnings out of Freddie and Fannie, again, on a pretext, the idea of avoiding another bailout or to repay the federal government. Federal government took all this money, which the shareholders should legitimately have gotten. And that's gone on since, that started and really, it's gone on since 2012 until now. So you've had really 5 years or 10 years almost of the entire theft of Fannie and Freddie, and the shareholders feel aggrieved in that entire period of time.
So they diluted their shares, then they get 10% of the dividends, and then Obama says we're going to do it at 100%. And we're going to talk about why that happened. There was an Obamacare crisis. He couldn't get any money for this, and he was trying to take money from one section that they'd appropriate funds for in Obamacare to another section, which was going to subsidize insurance for people who needed subsidies. And understand, this is at the core of Obamacare. The only metric by which they can say that Obamacare is a success is by talking about the number of people who have been insured. Because when we look at our insurance rates, those of us who are paying for our own insurance with a gun held to our heads are seeing Obamacare raising our insurance premiums by over 100% in many states. So that is not a metric that they can stick with. We're going to tell you how this happened. We're going to tell you what can be done by Trump to undo this illegal kleptocracy that we've got here called Obamacare. All right, Dr. Corsi, so we've got an Obamacare crisis. They don't have the money to transfer these funds over to subsidize insurance. And that is the key thing that they wanted to do, to say, hey, look, we've provided insurance for millions of people who didn't have it before. They don't want you to see how they're doing this. It's the ugly making of the sausage, as Bismarck talked about it. So what happens is we've got Health and Human Services Secretary Burwell tries to divert funds from one section of Obamacare to a different section of Obamacare that was not funded by Congress, and the House of Representatives sues. We have the case House of Representatives versus Burwell. Tell us what happened with that, the decision that came out May 12, 2016.
Well, the federal district court ruled that it is not in the authority of the administration to act as the legislator in terms of granting of funds. And if the House had not awarded any funds to pay these premiums to the low-cost insurance, then it was inappropriate for the Obama administration to transfer money from one section of ObamaCare to pay these premiums, which were critical to keeping Obamacare going, or to take the money from anywhere else in the budget. But what the Obama people realized was that Fannie and Freddie by 2012 had begun making a lot of money. They recovered. And so they said, well, we're going to have a net worth sweep. We're just going to take all the earnings out of Fannie and Freddie, and we're going to apply them to pay the Obamacare low-income premiums.
And before we get to that theft, I want to read you a couple quotes from your article here. This is from the judge, U.S. District Court Judge Rosemary Collier, the case and her decision that came out May 12, 2016. She said, Congress is the only source for such an appropriation. No public money can be spent without one. And then she went on to say, paying out these Section 1402 reimbursements without an appropriation thus violates the Constitution. So what Barack Obama did was he violated the Constitution by stealing money from another area that Congress had not appropriated money for. Congress spends the money, and they spend it for specific things. He didn't like the way they were doing it, so they just went somewhere else, totally unrelated, Fannie and Freddie, and stole it with what they call a net asset sweep. I love the euphemisms that the federal government uses.
Obama was particularly great in these. But you know what I'll point out too, we only found this, I found it, documented it with the help of one of the accountants who was involved in the beginning in the Fannie Freddie controversy, and going through the balance sheet of the Treasury and looking at the line items into which they took money from Fannie and Freddie and put it into line items where it could then go into Obamacare.
That's right.
And we tracked it out, and we really, I think, nailed it because it's irrefutable that you could see the transactions.
It was very deceptive the way they did it. They put it in there and they listed, I said, we've got liabilities coming up, as the Congressional Budget Office put this out there. And so we got liabilities coming up, and we got liabilities of health care subsidies. We got liabilities of Fannie and Freddie. So they make it sound like Fannie and Freddie is still sucking money out of the government. And yet when you looked at the balance sheet, as we see here,
right,
it's actually a negative amount of money that they're giving to Fannie and Freddie. So in other words, they're taking money. They're not giving money to Fannie and Freddie. They're taking it because it's a negative number.
That's right. And remember, this is money that could have been paid to shareholders. This is being stolen from the mom and pops, as well as the hedge funds and others who own the institutional funds that owned Fannie and Freddie stock. Instead of paying the dividends, which were legitimately and in corporate law needed to be paid, the Obama administration said, we're just not going to do that. We're going to steal the money, and we're going to apply it to Obamacare, where we were not given the appropriation by Congress. And the court appropriately said that Obama was violating the Constitution and deciding his own funding outside of the rules.
So they ignore the law, they ignore the Constitution, they ignore the judge's decision, they steal the money from the investors, then they report that it's going to be a subsidy to Fannie and Freddie, but when you look at the balance sheet, it's a negative number. I mean, the deception, the levels of deception here are just epic. Okay, so you report this, and then Fox News, Maria Bartiromo, has an interview with Steve Mnuchin May 1st, and she asks him about this because there's a lot of talk, obviously, as you would imagine, of investors whose money was stolen on Twitter talking about this. And she said there's a Twitter conversation going on, and it's been going on for some time about how President Obama needed money for Obamacare, and that he took it from Fannie and Freddie. Is that true? She asked Steve Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary. He says, it is true. He said the Obama administration, used the profits of Fannie and Freddie to pay for other parts of government while they kept taxpayers at risk. That's precisely the issue. He admitted it. So now we have the Treasury Secretary confirming what you found, the story that you broke back in February.
And what he means by that, what Mnuchin meant was that, that the money that was being stolen from Fannie and Freddie should have been used to retain capital in Fannie and Freddie in case they had losses. So that's putting the taxpayer at risk. Because if the money's not there, they have to get another bailout. And secondly, it's stealing the money from the shareholders who should have been given dividends when Fannie and Freddie had turned profitable again.
Violating the law, violating the Constitution, lying in the budget.
And stealing from pensioners and stealing from many people, mom and pop. These are average people who own these shares and had a legitimate right under corporate law to have their dividends paid when there were profits and money was being dispersed from Fannie and Freddie. The Obama administration had no authority under the Constitution or anywhere else to steal this money on a net worth sweep and use it to pay ObamaCare or whatever else they used it for.
No more authorization to do that than Obama had authorization to self-ratify the Paris Climate Agreement. He had no authority to do that. We have a process where the Senate ratifies it. We have a process for funding the government where the House of Representatives does that. He doesn't care what the Constitution says. He does this, he lies about it, he steals, and he breaks the law. So what's the solution now to the Obamacare crisis that Donald Trump has? And it's a very simple solution, isn't it, Dr. Corsi?
In fact, I've been writing about it extensively, that, first of all, it's just like the Paris Accord, the Climate Accord. You're right. It was never ratified by the Senate. It's not a treaty. Donald Trump just said, I'm not doing it.
Right.
Okay, well, Donald Trump has the authority here to say under the net worth sweep from Fannie and Freddie, I'm not doing it anymore. And so, therefore, there's no money to pay for the insurance subsidies under Obamacare.
And how does he do that? Because there's a court case. Going back to this court case, this decision that came from the U.S. District Judge, the Obama Justice Department appealed that decision. So it's still tied up in the courts, but they could finalize that decision how?
Well, if President Trump decides we're just not going to appeal the case.
Exactly. So just drop it. Say,
drop the case.
We're not going to fight it. And the U.S. District Court has said, here's what the Constitution says. The Congress allocates the money. They didn't allocate the money. You can't do this under the Constitution. We're just going to leave it there. We're not going to keep fighting the Constitution and this judge.
And Mel Watt, in fact, who is the administrator under the Federal Housing Finance Authority, he's the one who regulates Fannie and Freddie. He told the Senate Banking Committee in May 11th, this testimony, that he was going to end the net worth sweep at the end of the second quarter, which is coming up at the end of June, and he was going to retain the money in order to recapitalize Fannie and Freddie. Now, that effectively takes the money away that could be diverted into paying these insurance premiums. And what Congress needs to realize, and what the president needs to realize, is that money has never been appropriated, and it should have never been spent since 2012. Obamacare should have collapsed years ago.
Yes.
Except for this theft. And
the whole thing is fraudulent.
And I keep going back to, I want to make sure everybody understands that the money was also stolen from average people who invested in Fannie and Freddie in good faith.
That's right.
And we're looking for that return legitimately as dividends, shareholder increases in value, and often their retirement funds depended upon this.
That's right. Yeah, very much so. It's exactly the type of investment that people will look for an retirement fund. As you pointed out, people will look at this and say, hey, this is home mortgages. It's guaranteed by the government. Yeah, well, that's where I want to put my retirement funds because I want to preserve capital. So it's been a very important part of that. So that's the key. And that's one of the key solutions to this problem of Obamacare. It's been unconstitutional from the very beginning. It was based on fraud. It was based on violating the Constitution, deception, and stealing from individual investors.
And now there's some solutions, and I've been writing about the solutions. The solutions are going to be corporate finance solutions. Now, the problem is that the only way the shareholders are really going to get restitution is in the courts, and that's going to be very difficult. But I encourage the shareholders to continue the battle in the courts. They could win.
That's right.
And there are precedents for them to win. But the point is, there's a plan with this MOLIS plan, which is a Wall Street plan, which would allow Fannie and Freddie to recapitalize, the government to cash out its shares. And by 2020, the shares are projected to be as high as $13 a share. Now, if that happens, the shareholders will win, not as much as they should have won, but at least it will keep Fannie and Freddie alive as a plan to go forward to preserve home ownership for the middle class. And that's what I'm fighting for now, is to keep Fannie and Freddie alive, because senators like Senator Corker want the big banks to control this market.
Yes.
And
We have to understand that's very important. Just as we saw with the Paris Climate Treaty, there was There were individuals that were Republicans, individuals in the White House that wanted to keep this thing going. And so it's important to understand there's very powerful people within the establishment Republican Party who want to keep this thing going.
And the globalists, the people who want to have all Americans be renters and not to be able to have
own anything.
Yes. And so that's really what we're fighting. We're fighting not only for the values for the shareholders, which is going to have to be fought in the courts, but we're fighting to keep Fannie and Freddie alive so we preserve middle-class home ownership and the ability to build net worth with homes in the middle class for retirement.
And we're fighting for the rule of law. We're fighting for the Constitution. We're fighting to keep this type of fraud. This is just fraud and theft from individuals. It's not stealing it from one part of the government and giving it to the other part of the government. They're stealing it from individuals. They're deceptively reporting this. They're flagrantly violating the law, violating court orders from judges and so forth. So this is a very important issue here on a number of different levels. Very important research that you've done, Dr. Corsi. Thank you for your reporting on this, and we hope that this information gets to the Trump administration. He has the tools to do the right thing and shut down the fraud, expose the fraud of Obama and ObamaCare. For Infowars.com, I'm David Knight with Dr. Jerome Corsi. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've taken thousands of years of known research and put it together with our own 4 years of seeking and testing to find the very best systems that God gave us through Mother Nature to detoxify the body. That's why I'm introducing Z-Shield, toxic metal and chemical defense support. It's made in the USA. It's filled with known compounds from nature that are absolutely associated with detoxifying the body, and it supports the InfoWar. It is a classical 360 win. Our formula at InfoWarsLife.com is, quite frankly, simple. We go out and look at the recognized research, and we take it to the next level of quality, of purity, and of strength. Because this is what I personally use for myself and my family. We've gone through 5 or 6 different permutations in the last 4 years since we launched InfoWars Life to actually come up with this. This is the formula that I personally have been taking for over a year, and now we believe we have come as close to perfection when it comes to a detoxifier as you can possibly get. If you're not mitigating the pesticides, the heavy metals, the chemicals, if you're not trying to purify your water, if you're not trying to take products like Z-Shield, that are full of known concentrated compounds that help purify our cells and our bodies, you're crazy. You owe it to yourself, you owe it to your family, and you owe it to the future of this country and the world that patriots stay as healthy and as clean and as focused as you can be, because we need you, the remnant of America, to reignite those brush fires to the next level and to be healthy and as focused as you can be. Because if you're sick, if you're over there on the sidelines and not in the fight, you're basically giving in to the New World Order. Thanks to your support and your prayers, together, we're changing the world. Now it's time to change our bodies with Z-Shield at InfoWarsLife.com.